So that's what the book is about. It's about kind of getting away from the ongoing paradox or the impossible situation, the dilemma of wanting to believe something is true without being able to make yourself believe it to be true. What I want to do is say, yeah, but what you currently believe, you can nonetheless begin to orient yourself into Christian faith based upon what you currently believe.
So I guess the first question is, what do you mean by believe that it's true? Well, how could you possibly be a Christian and not believe in it precisely? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, the book begins by talking about the fact that Christianity is somewhat unique among world religions in its emphasis upon right belief or accepting doctrines. So Christians have been making creeds, which are statements of doctrine, since the beginning. You have like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and so on. You got various statements of belief, confessions, catechisms, all of which list doctrines that Christians are supposed to believe. That's quite different from Judaism or Islam or many other major world religions, which have very minimalist requirements in terms of belief. So it creates a real challenge for somebody if they're like, hey, I'm interested in becoming a Christian, or I want to be a Christian or continue to be, but I've got doubts or disbeliefs about particular doctrines. How can I be a part of this community even when I have these doubts or disbeliefs? And so I wrote the book for people who are either sympathetic disbelievers, they'd like to become a Christian or they're interested in it, but they have significant doubts or questions, and also people who are self-identifying as Christians at the moment, but who nonetheless find themselves beset by some pretty deep doubts. So what the book does is try to provide a framework for thinking about Christian life and discipleship in a way that doesn't sort of prevent the barrier, doesn't place a barrier to entry for people who have significant doubts and disbeliefs. So
the question that immediately springs to mind, or two questions rather, is we'll start with the first one, is where exactly is the limit there, right? Like there has to be a point in which you do not believe enough of what Christianity is in order to you disbelieve so much of it that you really shouldn't be considered a Christian anymore. Where's that line precisely? Is it at the resurrection? Is it and all men are made in the image of God? Like where exactly would that line be for you, do you think?
So the question itself, I think we always need to think about questions themselves, and sometimes they have assumptions. So the question, well, when should you not be considered a Christian? That question can be interpreted in different ways. One way to interpret it is in terms of salvation. What do you have to believe in order to be saved? And that's actually an enormously difficult, complex question, and it's not one that I'm typically engaged in, because I'm going to let God sort that out. Another question is, well, what do you have to believe in order to participate in this community? That's what we would call an ecclesiological question, a question about the community of faith. But that question is also enormously complex, because it could be, well, what do you have to believe in order to be a pastor or a church leader here? Or it could be, what do you have to believe in order to become a member? Or what do you have to believe in order to just attend the services? Those are all different questions. And
would just being able to attend the services qualify you as a Christian?
So again, it's like, what do we mean by qualify as a Christian? So one of the things,
I'm asking you.
Yeah. So, but this is it. Like, we have to think, well, what are we actually asking? So what I did in the book is I wrote essentially 3 different creeds. One is a creed for a person who would, at this point in their life, identify as an atheist, but they nonetheless have interest in Christianity. The second is a creed for somebody who would identify as a naturalist, but who has interest in Christianity. And then the final is someone who is what I would call a doubter, but they want to identify with Christianity. And so in each case, these creeds build on one another. They become more and more complex. So the most basic, the atheist creed, this is somebody who they're saying, I don't believe there is any supernatural reality. I don't believe there is any God at all. How could I be a Christian? And so for those people, I say, well, let's just begin with Jesus. Can you identify with the life and teaching of Jesus, and particularly his call to love your neighbor as yourself? Now, that is an extraordinarily lofty call. It's a call that I don't think any Christian in history has mastered, to truly love your neighbor as yourself. If you were sympathetic to Christianity, and you simply wanted to commit to loving your neighbor as yourself in the manner that Jesus lived and taught, that is an amazing point at which to begin. You may believe there is no God, let alone that all the major Christian doctrines are true. But if you commit to loving your neighbor as yourself, you have now begun on the journey toward Christian faith. And to that degree, you are beginning to participate in the outer periphery of Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to do there, then going on to the next steps of the naturalist and then the doubter, is to successively move people into deeper levels of Christian faith and sanctification, like conforming themselves to the life and teaching of Jesus. So that's what the book is about. It's about kind of getting away from the ongoing paradox or the impossible situation, the dilemma of wanting to believe something is true without being able to make yourself believe it to be true. What I want to do is say, yeah, but what you currently believe, you can nonetheless begin to orient yourself into Christian faith based upon what you currently believe. If you want to love your neighbor as yourself, that's an amazing place to begin.
Well, I do find that reflective of my personal position on it. It's I find myself unable to force myself into believing the supernatural stuff as much as I might enjoy the result of doing so. But I think there's a deeper question here. This is also probably a complicated one that I think we could explore a little bit. Is why is love thy neighbor as you love thyself seem to be the most fundamental commandment of Christianity, or most fundamental belief? I'm just assuming that that's the case because it's the most peripheral creed. And if that's the case, how should one love themselves and how should one love neighbors? Isn't that what the rest of the Christian doctrines are for? Can you follow that action in such an abstract and vague format? How is that even possible?
Okay, so on the first question, Jesus, when he was asked to summarize the law in the Gospels, says, what is the law in its essence? He actually says there are two central commandments upon which all other commands of the law rest.
Yeah.
The first is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. Okay. So that would seem to me to be a great place to begin. And so with the atheist who believes there is no God or supernatural, I begin with the second of those commands because they don't believe there is a God to love. Nonetheless, they believe there's a neighbor to love. So I begin there. And I say, if you can begin to work on that and pursue that in your life, if that is of interest to you, you are already in one of the two commands that summarize all of the law. That's pretty amazing.
Sure.
Now, the second part of your question, I'm going to defer for a moment. But I just want to then turn to the next issue is Jesus says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Well, the second chapter on naturalism addresses that. See, a naturalist is a person who believes that only nature exists. But some, I'm sorry, I flipped this around. So for the naturalist, they believe only nature exists, but they're open to potentially to other spiritual realities that are transcending nature, that are beyond nature. And I give two examples of atheists who would identify in this way. So, for example, you have an atheist philosopher named J.L. Schellenberg, and you have another one. I'm sorry, I flipped it around, atheist and naturalist. The first chapter is naturalist, so they believe only nature exists. The second is an atheist, but they're open to something beyond nature. So the J.L. Schellenberg is the first one. He is a well-known philosopher and atheist, but he believes there may be something beyond nature. Okay, so what I say is for people like that, the other is Ronald Dworkin, well-known atheist, believes there may be something beyond nature. I said, if you believe there may be something beyond nature, it's like a form of the good or something that transcends nature, well, then you could begin to love that thing. You don't have to believe yet that it's a personal agent, but you can believe it's something that transcends and goes beyond nature. And so that's how you can begin to love God and your neighbor, seek to pursue both of those commands that summarize all of the law, even though at that point you are still an atheist. Now, in terms of the first question, well, how can you even begin to love neighbor if you don't have any thick conception of what that looks like, right?
Right.
Well,
like,
I mean,
in our reality, we have very different ideas of what constitutes as loving somebody. There's a certain side of the political aisle who would say my idea of loving somebody is like brutal and like restrictive, and I'd say their version of loving somebody is borderline child abuse, like stuff like that. So isn't that what the rest of Christianity is for?
So I would say this is, in a sense, gets into the field of ethics. Well, you're always going to have disagreements, disputes, debates about particular ethical issues, and also politics. Or you could also get into politics. What does the good society look like? You're going to get different visions of what that looks like. But I think 90% of what it means to love your neighbor, we can get some pretty common agreement on. So Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Right? So sort of a baseline right there. That's going to guide us, think, 90% plus of our interactions with other human beings. And so, for example, in Matthew 25, he gives concrete examples. Like for the person who's thirsty, if you give them something to drink. If the person who is in prison, if you visit them. If the person who is naked, if you clothe them. These are like basic things that we would appreciate it if someone did that for us. Then we should likewise extend that to the other person. Very practical example. My wife and daughter never tire of pointing out that I'm not the best driver. I mean, I'm not the most courteous driver. I can be a little aggressive in traffic. So one thing I try as a discipline to remind myself is to drive and interact with others on the motorways as I would like them to interact with me. If I would appreciate it if someone else let me merge into traffic, I should let them merge in front of me. It's a simple thing, but those are the kinds of disciplines that when we pursue them in our daily life, step by step, we begin to conform ourselves more closely to the love of neighbor. So we can always get into philosophical debates about things like the trolley problem, a famous debate among philosophers, which we don't have to get into here, but it's an ethical conundrum. What do you do? Sure. Do you do the non-action or the action if the non-action will save different number of lives than the action in terms of flipping the trolley switch? But we don't have to worry about the trolley switch question. What we can do is, for most situations, we know what it looks like to love our neighbor more. Let's focus on those issues.
Well, I'm actually gonna take inspiration on this next question from somebody in chat. So granting the idea that the main bulk of Christianity is the self-evident stuff, is like the clothing, the feeding, the watering, as opposed to more controversial political issues. Is Christianity really necessary for these ideas? This is something somebody in the chat is saying. These ideas seem pretty common sense to us now. Is Christianity really necessary for these types of ideas?
Yeah. So the book, The Doubter's Creed. First of all, it's not written. I've written 16 books. Yeah. I've written books that do other things, right, including defending Christianity for a skeptical audience. The purpose of the book, The Doubter's Creed, is not to win over people who are skeptical of Christianity at the outset and think, why do I need to be a Christian in the first place? The goal of this book is to reach out to people who are either sympathetic disbelievers or Christian doubters. For those people, I don't need to justify the value of becoming a Christian. What I need to do, rather, is remove barriers to becoming a Christian for those who find that they are hampered by the inability to believe particular doctrines. So that's the audience that I wrote the book for. So I agree that the question that the person in the chat asks is an important one. You could ask, well, why should I become a Christian in the first place? Do I need Christianity to believe the Golden Rule? Isn't the Golden Rule believed across religious traditions? In fact, it is, right? Yeah. C.S. Lewis, at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, he gives a table which he calls the Tao of religious belief, or the Tao, something like that, of religion and ethics. And what he does is he goes through all these major religious and ethical systems and shows how they agree on all these different things, such as do unto others as you would have them do unto you, do not lie, honor your parents. These are not doctrines that are unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition, nor has any Christian who I think is, well, there have been some Christians who have tried to argue these are unique to Christianity, but that's clearly false. And it's never been a teaching of Christianity that they're unique to Christianity. Paul, for example, in Romans 1 and 2, gives multiple examples of how the law of God or moral knowledge is written on the heart, right? It's something innate.
Right.
in us. And so it's not something that is revealed uniquely in Christianity or Judaism. So that knowledge is available to everybody. What I just want to say is if you want to pursue that knowledge, have an interest in Christianity, you can begin to conform your life to the life and teaching of Jesus, even if you are a naturalist and you believe that only nature exists, or even if you are an atheist and you believe there is no God. You can nonetheless begin the journey into Christianity.
So you said you had a creed for Christian doubters. We've already gone over the atheists and the naturalists. What would be the creed for the Christian doubters, precisely?
Okay, so for the Christian who's a Christian doubter, I said these creeds build on one another. So the atheist creed, or the naturalist creed, I should say, that begins the book, as I believe Jesus modeled an exemplary life of goodness and love, and I strive to emulate that life by loving my neighbor as myself, right? So that's the first one we talked about. If you believe that nature is all that exists, there's nothing beyond nature, you can nonetheless begin to love your neighbor. And then you have the atheist creed, the person who's open to something beyond nature, but doesn't believe it's a personal deity. They can nonetheless also love neighbor, and they can also add this. I believe there's an absolute source of goodness, meaning, and human flourishing in a reality that we may call God, and we may strive to love that reality with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Yeah.
The example I give here, one example I give here, in addition to the two that I mentioned, so J.L. Schellenberg and Ronald Dworkin, is Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein did not believe in a personal deity. What he famously said was he believed in the God of Spinoza, which is an impersonal absolute that transcends nature. And my point there is you could begin to love that impersonal absolute by, if you believe that is the source of moral goodness, meaning, and purpose, you could begin to conform your life to it, even though you don't believe it as a personal deity. And then the Doubter's Creed, the last stage, it builds on those two, and then it also says this: I believe in the church as a community of disciples that offers me a context to live out the love of God and neighbor as described in the Apostles' Creed, and which can sustain me when I doubt. The point that I'm driving home there is that creeds themselves are never just individual confessions of belief and conviction, as if you have to believe all these things and believe them with certainty in order to be a part of the Christian community. Rather, the Christian community encompasses and has room for all manner of doubt and questioning. We need to normalize a recognition of the fact that Christianity is consistent with doubts and with having room for doubts. In the same way that a married couple, they marry, and when they marry, they confess essentially like a creed in terms of their marital vows. Every day going forward in their marriage, they may not always believe in those vows. The point is not that they believe in the vows, however, the point is that they live into the vows. This is what Eugene Peterson called a long obedience in the same direction. If you persist even when you doubt, that's what Christian discipleship is like, just like that's what a faithful and successful marriage is like.
Okay, so you actually kind of predicted my next question, because my next question was going to be all manner of doubt, really? It seems like it makes the category so broad it's not useful, but it seems like the line is as long as you are actively and consciously trying, that's trying to act in accordance with the Christianity, then it's fair to use the term Christianity. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, there's all sorts of questions here that are going to be particularized for an individual and in the individual's context. So, for example, let's say you have a person who is a pastor, and he begins to doubt, or she begins to doubt, that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, at what point is that pastor obliged to share those doubts with the elders of the church or with the wider congregation? When they just are fleeting doubts, or when they linger, or when they disbelieve for a period of time that Jesus rose from the dead, or when it becomes an unshakable conviction that he rose from the dead. I mean, those are all questions that every person is going to have to sort out. The pastor is going to have to sort it out. Likewise, the person who is going to church and partaking of communion and begins to have doubts about something or disbelieve something, at what point do they have to withdraw from some degree of participation in the life of the community? Those are all questions that every individual is going to have to address for themselves. But I want to say that a Christian church is not the thought police, and that it doesn't matter what you believe. that you should be welcome to join a community of faith and participate in the life of that community, even if you have all sorts of doubts and disbeliefs. So, I mean, that's what I want to do, is to create an open door for people who have doubts and disbelief, but who want to journey into exploring participation in the community of faith.
Right, but who want to? So yeah, if they want to, if they have that desire to, yeah, no matter anything else, that's kind of the standard. So that makes sense to me, because I was wondering, I was like, all right, well, where's the standard exactly? And it seems like active attempt, active desire, active effort. That's it. So I'm going to. Scott says churches are thought police by definition. We'll get him in. He'll call in a second here. So here's my thing. I personally think that rules and dogmas, when in their proper place and not pathologized, are actually kind of useful. Because, as much as I'd love to rely on my own moral sense, I am human, and I am, and I guess to use Christian language, I'm inherently sinful. I'm inherently imperfect. And you can use those rules to guide you and to know the rules by which to live your life, and to overcome the fallibility of your own senses. So is there really no value in those creeds and living by those dogmas? Or I'm not saying that you're saying that there's no value there, but is there value there? I guess would be my question to you.
Well, the first thing, I like that you said live by, because too often people, certainly in the conservative evangelical tradition that I was raised in, they tend to think about creeds in a very over-intellectualized manner, that they are simply a set of propositions that you assent to the truth thereof. That's not what a creed is. Again, I think a creed should be understood as a performative statement that defines a community of faith. And even if you find yourself doubting at various points in the creed, what is important for it is that you're identifying with this community of faith. And a community of faith, I will say, is only as good as the actions that flow from that community of faith. If we always keep in mind, again, to come back to things like the love of God and the love of neighbor, if you have a community of faith that is not living into the love of neighbor, then whatever intellectual confession of faith that community has is not going to mean much. And Jesus, of course, certainly is unsparing in his criticism of people who might confess the right doctrines, but who have not lived them out consistently in their life.
Right, and I see that quite a bit, actually, unfortunately, is very avowed Christians, people who talk about all the time, don't live with the forgiveness and some of the love for the neighbor. So that's definitely something that's common. I actually want to backtrack just for a second, because I had another thought here. So if the active desire, the wanting to get involved with a community of faith, is tantamount to being Christian, but the getting involved is something like loving your neighbor, which is not an exclusively Christian idea, then why isn't somebody like the sympathetic, like the atheist who wants to live that way, not involved in Judaism or Buddhism or Confucianism as opposed to Christianity, since the principles that they're trying to follow are broader than any one religion? Or is it all about their intent to join Christianity specifically?
Well, there's so much in the question. I mean, the one thing I certainly haven't said, again, like when you said that's all it is to be a Christian. Again, we have the ambiguity of the question as to what that means in terms of, are we talking about salvation? Are we talking about participating in a church? If we're talking about the latter, then what do we mean? Do we mean taking on membership in a church, taking a first communion, participating in the sacraments? So there's enormous complexity there. There's also, so in terms of the soteriology or the salvation question.
Pretty important one.
Well, C.S. Lewis, he's beloved often of conservative evangelicals, and yet I think they don't often recognize how radical some of his theology could be relative to some theology that's common among conservative evangelicals. I'll give you an example. This is directly relevant to what we're talking about. At the end of the book, The Last Battle, which is the conclusion of the Narnia series, you have a fellow named Emmett, which is this character. It's the Hebrew for truth. And the interesting thing is he has worshipped a false god named Tash, who is a harsh god and a wicked god, in fact. But Emmett worshipped Tash as best he could, believing that Tash was the real god. And Emmett discovers afterwards that, in fact, Tash was a false god, a false conception of the divine, and that the real god is, in fact, Aslan. Now, this clearly is meant to parallel Christianity with, and I don't even think here we would say something like Buddhism, but rather we would even, in fact, say a sort of a religious conception where the deity is malevolent and capricious. And that's the person that Emmett is paralleling here. But what happens is, see, on the conservative evangelical construction, well, what happens to Emmett is he goes to hell because he didn't worship Aslan, right? He didn't confess belief in Aslan during his life. But in fact, what Aslan says in the narrative is that he will accept the worship that was given to Tash as unto himself. And what C.S. Lewis there is saying is we should think about other religious expressions to the extent that people pursue those expressions in goodwill as best they can, their best understanding of the divine, and they seek to live out the pursuit of that religious understanding as best they can in a way that manifests Christian principles, such as the love of God of neighbor. Then just as Aslan would accept worship to Tash as unto himself, so the Christian God would accept worship in these other deities as unto himself. That is actually what the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church has been since Vatican II. And I think Protestants need to recognize more widely to have that kind of expansive and hopeful doctrine of salvation themselves. And I'll give you a very maybe provocative example that I give in the book. So in 1994, the Rwandan genocide unfolded between April and July of that year. And during those 3 months, Hutus, the majority ethnic population, slaughtered and massacred the Tutsi minority population to the tune of 800,000 people, chopped apart with the use of close contact cutting implements. It was horrific, one of the most terrible genocides of the 20th century. In the midst of that genocide, there was a church of Tutsis who were hiding from the unfolding genocide, and they called out to their Hutu pastor. He was a Christian pastor named Elizafanda Katarama, and they were begging him for help. Instead, what he did was he directed the militias to where his congregants were hiding, and they were all slaughtered. And then you have another fellow. His name was Mbaye Diagne, and Mbaye Diagne was a Muslim, and he was working with the UN peacekeeping forces in Kigali. And every day he went out and left the compound and risked his life to save Tutsis within the country who were hiding from the genocidaires that were carrying out the genocide. He ended up saving about 100 people before he himself was killed. And I ask Christians this. So you have on the one hand the Christian pastor who carried out the genocide on his own flock. And then you have the Muslim UN peacekeeper who saved multiple lives. From a Christian perspective, the Christian pastor had more correct theology. But there's no question which of the two was living more in accord with the life and teaching of Jesus. So I say, if you had to choose between those two, which of those two legacies would you want to bring before the throne of God? Personally, I don't think there's a question that I would rather have the bad theology, but lived a life that saved multiple other lives in emulation of the life and teaching of Jesus. And if you want to take that view as well, I think you've got a good ground for the kind of optimism that I'm presenting in the book. Say, let's begin to participate in the life of faith and move further into what it means to be a disciple of Jesus.
And you said that this is you mentioned that the Catholics support this particular interpretation, the C.S. Lewis style. I actually read Mere Christianity a couple months ago, and I really enjoyed it. That's part of what inspired me to start thinking about this a little bit more. But it seems like as long as you have the good intent behind it, as long as you are, pursuing the correct things, even if you're kind of doing it potentially the wrong way, you're basically good. Is what I'm hearing.
So the one thing I would just want to say to clarify is that the claim is never you've done enough, that you're somehow reconciled to God through good works. But I often get that as a misunderstanding, particularly, again, from the conservative evangelicals who often think, so you're claiming we're saved because we've done enough good works? No. What I'm saying is What a life lived in reconciliation to God looks like is the kind of life that produces the fruit of loving your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the Catholic Church was influenced by a major Catholic theologian of the 20th century named Karl Rahner, who developed a theology of what he called anonymous Christians. And so he said, you could be a Buddhist, you could be a Muslim, you could be an atheist, but if you're living in a way that is in accord with the life and teaching of Jesus, that could be evidence of God's Spirit already working salvifically in your life. Now, some people take offense, and I'll just note this as a footnote. Some people take offense to this, saying, well, I don't want to be an anonymous Christian. And I'll say, well, fair enough. But if you don't want to be reconciled to God ultimately, then don't worry. He's not going to force it. But I would say if Buddhism is true or Islam is true, then I would want to be an anonymous Buddhist or Muslim relative to what the true reality about salvation is. So I think if we are thinking properly about this, then I don't think that it should be viewed as a threatening or triumphalistic concept.
All right, we're gonna start bringing in some callers. The way this works is basically like talk radio. I put them on, and then they ask a question, and then you can answer. We have a lot of callers, and we don't have a ton of time, so Schneckie's a drop something. So we're gonna limit to one question, and then maybe a follow up if they plead their case to me. Unlike the Christian God, apparently I'm very arbitrary and capricious in my decisions. So, Tree, welcome. What do you got? Tree, come on, buddy. Sometimes this happens. All right, Tree, if you're here, you're gonna have to hop back in line. Sorry, mate. Carnal, how you doing?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay, great. This is kind of an unusual concept. I kind of felt like I was unique in some of these perspectives that you have. I grew up in Christianity, in church, up until sometime in my 30s. I don't remember exactly when I dropped off, so to speak. But I stopped chasing faith and came to the realization that there is nothing supernatural, at least not accessible to us in our current state. Now, whether that changes under the influence of psilocybin or DMT or something like that, and we messing with our pineal gland, I don't know. I haven't had that opportunity to experience that yet. But the divinity and the scriptures being influenced by God and the resurrection of the Son of God, all that stuff seems like just nonsense. The entire purpose of church just seems like it's to just draw wealth and assert power. That seems like the only real purpose to me. That's basically.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I'll just give you an example in the in the chapter, the first chapter about naturalism, where I'm saying following the life and teaching of Jesus. I give some examples, and one of them is Martin Luther King Jr., who, interestingly, he was first of all really intrigued. Well, so he knew that Jesus had taught about loving your neighbor as yourself, but he didn't think that was practical, and nonviolence. That he didn't think that was a practical thing to pursue to change society. And it was Mahatma Gandhi who ultimately changed Martin Luther King's view. It was Gandhi who applied the teaching of Jesus in a way that really transformed modern India. And then Martin Luther King used that as well as a basis in the civil rights movement to bring about enormous social change within American society and race relations. And I would submit that it's in those kinds of things, in those moments, when people take Jesus most seriously, that you find the church at its best. So there's no shortage of bad examples of church. I think that the recent alignment of the Republican Party with Donald Trump, or I should say evangelicals with the Republican Party and Donald Trump, is an example of some lamentable expressions of Christianity. And to give you an example, there was a Pew study done a year or two ago and found that the people, the major American demographic group who were most suspicious of refugees were white evangelical Christians. And I can't think of something that's further away from Jesus, who reached out, who lived his life to reach out to people like refugees. So there are many examples where Christianity has failed. But I would submit to focusing on the best moments of Christianity, like the civil rights movement.
Okay, see, now I'm actually, you sparked a really large question in me, because at the very beginning, we were talking about how applying Christianity to stuff like politics is like somewhat difficult. But now we've gotten to the immigration thing a little bit. I mean, I think I'd agree that if like one personally just doesn't like refugees, I think it's pretty obvious that you're in violation of some basic Christianity there. But what about just general foreign policy standards about having like, strict borders? Would you find that to be anti-loving your neighbor, for example? Would that be anti the teachings of Jesus? Or I'm just
people first of all, I would always want to say that we always have to be careful about aligning Christianity with any specific political or social platform. I think that Christians should be found across the political spectrum. You should have Christians who are being salt and light within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, as independents. I'm Canadian, and within Canada, I would say the same thing across the political spectrum here. And so Christians can disagree in goodwill about particular policies. What I can do is highlight the degree to which, well, particularly in this case, right-wing news agencies, like let's say Fox News, have appealed to xenophobic associations, fear-based associations of refugees. So, for example, in 2018, during the election in 2018, there was incessant talk about caravans, quote-unquote caravans of refugees coming to the border. There were stories about them being associated with leprosy. So what you have, and there's also this very common language of referring to these people, refugees, as illegals. Well, in fact, these are people who are applying under international law for refugee status because they're often escaping violence in places like El Salvador and Guatemala. And the fact that this dehumanizing language and fear-based language and xenophobia is used often to otherize these groups is, for me, what is very concerning. I understand that people can have different views of the border, but that's another issue.
So it's the rhetoric. So you could have the exact same position of saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't let this many people into the country this quickly for various reasons, but you just think that dehumanizing rhetoric is the true...
Well, it's about more than rhetoric. So, for example, the Trump administration, beginning with Jeff Sessions, undertook a policy of forcibly separating children from their parents to serve as a mode of deterrence for further refugees applying for status. And I mean, that's in violation of international law. And I think it's just a grossly immoral thing to do as well, to separate children from their parents. So there's certainly policy at play as well. And I do think that is an immoral policy, not only in violation of international law, but I also think it's in violation of Christian convictions. So yes, it is about more than just rhetoric.
But okay, so that particular part of border policy, sure, although Carnal is saying that might not be true, but anybody can look into that if you want. But what about just the policy of just like not letting people into the country, like, having borders that actually turn people away occasionally? Is that like, do you think that Christians can disagree on that? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry to put you in a corner there, but I was curious. All right, Brett, thanks for coming in, man. What's your question?
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Randall, love your stuff so far. Agreed with pretty much nearly everything you said. For reference, I don't hold to a specific religion. The closest religion I would follow would be perennialism, if you even consider that a religion. But yeah, for me, it's the fundamental marker that, love thy neighbor is a universal human civilization thing, because otherwise human civilizations wouldn't function. And I completely agree with you on the dehumanization thing. It's something I'm trying to wrap my head around. I guess my question, because I know there's people online, my question for you is, why do you think, besides our primal, possibly biological nature, why is it that, people can't see that, just because a person's Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, another religion besides your own, why are we so quick to dehumanize others? Is it literally just a survival tactic? Is it a war for resources? Is it just some part of our animalistic nature that doesn't acknowledge that the humanity in my neighbor's children is just as important as the humanity in my offspring? What's your perspective there?
Thanks for your question, Brett. It's a great question. I think every worldview or every perspective, there are like four basic questions that they have to wrestle with. And so one is, what is ultimate, or what is ultimately real? A second question is, what are human beings? A third question is, what is our problem? And the fourth question is what is our end or purpose, if any? And different worldviews will have different answers for that. So the third question, excuse me, what is our problem? That's sort of the sum of your question here. Where does this come from? I mean, there are so many examples of it, of course. David Livingston Smith is a great example. He wrote a book called Less Than Human, talks about the human tendency down through history to otherize and dehumanize and objectify, the most overt cases being things like genocide. Well, of course, from a Christian perspective, it comes in a doctrine of the fall, right? That there was some primordial fall, some separation between God and human beings and God's will for human beings. Traditional interpretations of the fall, you've got things like young earth creationist and old earth creationist. There are also theistic evolutionary accounts of the fall. And so those would be accounts that seek to understand the fall in terms of evolutionary biology and factors like that as well. But whatever your ultimate account of that is, I think it is pretty universally recognized that we do have that triggered tendency to double down, to otherize, to dehumanize. And so from the Christian perspective, and I think from many of these different religious perspectives, we do need to develop and pursue ways to deal with this corruption of our nature, to deal with the fact that things are not the way they should be. And I would just submit, for those who are interested in pursuing that from a Christian perspective, I've offered them a means to begin to think in that direction.
Yeah, very definitely very interesting. We have a ton of callers. I'm gonna get drawn and quartered if I don't get to them. Morgan, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. What is your question for our good apologist here?
Sure. So first off, thanks for the combo, both of you. Very interesting. My question just does kind of focus around the axiom of Christ. I think that if you look at Christ's teaching, certainly Christ's teachings and his life teach us about cooperation. And typically dogma is a divisive thing. And so like earlier, you guys talked about the many different examples of Christ-like life that exist in all sorts of dogmas. And so I guess my question really is just that, what is the utility of associating it with a specific figure like Christ for specifically someone who is perhaps not a believer in Christ's divinity?
So my first thing is not to think about it in terms of utility. What I'm interested in is people who for various reasons are interested in pursuing this understanding more in terms of Christianity. And they could have various reasons. So, for example, you could have somebody, and they could have utilitarian concerns. Let's say, for example, you have a young couple. They're having children, and they realize that giving those children a religious framework can be that there are certain statistical evidence that people who have a stable, healthy religious framework are going to have more increased happiness and be able to cope with traumatic life events in a more effective way than people who have no framework or structure. And they reject the sort of naive individualism that thinks we can just create structures of meaning and significance by ourselves as individuals. They recognize the importance of participating in a community that's been established over a very long period of time. From that perspective, they could say, yeah, well, why not join the Christian community then and begin to work in that direction, not least because it's the largest religion in terms of numbers. And in its best expressions, such as I gave with Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, it can become a very ennobling and powerful transformative catalyst for good and for change within society.
I'm going to weigh in very humbly on this. So I've from what I do know, is one of the answers to this question is, why do you need Christ when you have God? And one of the reasons is because human beings fundamentally were very good at imitation. And to have a figure that wasn't just like an abstract set of rules, that wasn't just like the most absolute abstract, but to have a actual human being who is more easy to mimic and understand, like as you were just talking about, maybe just the life and teachings of Christ are all you really need. Maybe that's easier than the abstract rules. That's a explanation that I've heard for why it was necessary for a human figure like Christ to be introduced.
So that would be a concept of mimesis. The whole idea of, I mean, if we think that the central life of Jesus was a life where he sacrificed himself for others, and he modeled us to do the same. He says, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." Then what he has modeled for us is to go do what he has done. Now, I kind of think, if you think about, let's say you had a general in an army who himself had never seen the battlefield, that's not going to have the same resonance for the soldiers who were fighting on the front lines as the general who himself had fought on the front lines. And if you have a deity that themselves has never had the human experience, they've never suffered, they've never taken up their cross in self-sacrifice, it's a different thing in a sense than the deity that themselves has become one of us, has entered into the full depth of the human experience, even to the point of death, in service to others, and then calls us to undertake that which they have done. Now, this actually was significant for the early church. I think, for example, Irenaeus was a bishop of the late 2nd century. He came to minister in the city of Lyon, southern France, or Gaul. And he came there just after the church of Gaul had suffered from extraordinary persecutions, including people being tortured to death. And one of the teachings that Irenaeus brought to encourage the church that survived was that God has not asked you to experience anything that he and his son did not himself experience.
Right.
So I agree with that sort of a further development of your point.
All right, Scott, welcome. Scott has been very chatty in the chat, so thanks for being here as always, Scott. What you got for us?
I have been. I mean, religion is always one of those things that really gets me. And to me, it seems you're not really arguing for the actual factual resurrection of Christ. You're arguing more for the metaphorical understanding of what makes humans be better, right? So to me, this does not require any religion at all. Like this thing existed with human beings throughout the entire evolutionary process to get us to the point where we would even have created a God in the first place, right? And that's a thing. Like to me, it seems like it's one of these things like you recognize this yourself, but you think everybody else is stupid enough that they need to believe this, or else things are going to end terribly. And I don't think that's true. It's like telling a kid there's Santa Claus until they realize there's not a Santa Claus. To me, with my daughter, she knew right off the bat there was no such thing as Santa Claus. So when the time came that she would have found out that Santa Claus didn't exist, she didn't fucking care. Right? Like this is to me, this is the more important factor, because you are right in a lot of what you're saying. Like what really matters to human beings is connecting with another human being. But this is based off of our evolutionary process where we are fundamentally social. Like we need to be cared about, and we need to care about other beings like ourselves, right? And like to me, I don't think a God is needed for that. I think there just needs to be like something fundamentally radical where people can just say, "Hey, I fucking love you, dude, and fucking I hope you love me. If you don't, I'm still gonna love you."
Yeah.
Okay, Scott. So you said that I think people are stupid, which I don't. I think that's inappropriate. you also compared religious belief to belief in Santa Claus, which I don't think is an accurate comparison, because people who become educated and grow up don't continue to believe in Santa Claus, but there are many people at the very height of their disciplines in areas from philosophy to science to politics, etc., who remain deeply committed and devout theists. So it's just a disanalogy. You criticize me for not defending the resurrection, but as I said earlier, and you surmised inappropriately that I'm not committed to a historical resurrection. That's not true. As I said, the point of this book is not to defend true claims of Christianity. The point of this book is to remove barriers for entry to Christianity to those who are interested in doing so, which clearly you are not. If you're interested in a defense of the historic resurrection, I've got a chapter in the book God or Godless on that topic. I debated Godless Engineer on that topic, which is available online. And far more than me, there are people like N.T. Wright's 700-page book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is an extended defense of the resurrection by one of the world's leading ancient Near Eastern historians, or a friend of mine, Michael Licona's work. Many others have written on that topic, so there's no shortage of apologetic defenses of it. You said, I don't think God is needed to care. Well, again, the point of the book is not to convince you otherwise. But for those who are interested, the book offers an entryway for them into Christianity. And one thing I do appreciate what you said is you talked about love and the importance of love. I would just want to say that the love is not simply a biological response. I think love is something that brings us into a transcendent ground of something that exists beyond ourselves. And the question is, theologically and ethically, how should we relate to this reality of love that transcends ourselves? And that's what the book invites people to consider.
I have an angle to this too, not really the religious one, but just for Scott, who I'm not going to let speak again because we have to get through the rest of our callers, but you can feel free to chat your responses. I think that you can use just evolutionary social biology to explain why we're supposed to why human beings can do it naturally, but that only really explains why loving your neighbor is useful. It doesn't explain why it's good in any objective transcendental sense, and that's actually kind of a problem. To my mind, at least. I like for things to be good or bad more so than just useful or not useful. So that's also an angle. Tree.
Am I audible?
Okay, I hope you can talk to us this time. How you doing, man? What you got? We're doing rapid fire for the end here. What's your question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Oh, great, fantastic. So I used to be, an evangelical Christian. So I remember reading through a lot of the Bible, right? And there's certainly a lot of really interesting things in there that are, some of which I find kind of completely reprehensible these days, like the way Job was treated, the kind of advice given to slaves to treat their masters with kindness. The idea that they were able to kill somebody for refusing to give their money to the church. There's just so many things in the Bible that are just it makes sense why people would have thought that, that was a good idea. And maybe a lot of the ideas why it was so successful originally were about the idea of, it was an improvement on what was there in place already. In the same way that maybe Islam had some improvements to Mecca and Medina. But I'm wondering, given that the core message, right, the thing that's most core to this idea, what is the most good thing that you can do, right, is to listen and obey to God, right? That was a question that was literally asked, Jesus, what is the best thing you can do? And what is the most good thing of the law, which is to listen to God and obey Him, right? And there's so much sort of morality in that, in that sort of incongruous or disagrees with the ideas that we hold today, as true, and the most Christians hold to be true. Why would I take a document like that, that at its core disagrees with my atheism and has a lot of things wrong? Why do I take that and make that part of my identity or even let it inform my moral perspective any more than any other random book that I happen to read.
Thanks for your question, Tree. Once again, the question is while it's an important question, it is, first of all, focused in an area that was not my burden in this book. So again, I'm not in this book aiming to provide an apologetic defense for people who have particular skepticism or objections to the Bible. I will point out, if you're interested, that I wrote a book called Jesus Loves Canaanites, Reading Biblical Violence in Light of Moral Intuition. It's a 360-page extended book that engages in philosophy, theology, hermeneutics to present the full depth of the problem of biblical violence in particular, and specifically that of Canaanite genocide, and then to show how traditional responses that have often been popular among conservative Christians do not work, and to show what the best ways to think about that problem are in light of the fact that those traditional problems do not work. And the hermeneutic, the approach to interpretation that I lay out in that book, which could be broadly called a Christocentric hermeneutic of moral formation, is one that would apply to many of the other examples that you've briefly given in your question as well. So my suggestion would be, for further on that topic, you could look at that book where I address a lot of those issues. Paul, in 2 Timothy 3:14-17, just to give a brief response to it, he summarizes what the point of the Bible is, which is to teach, rebuke, and correct, and train in righteousness. In other words, the Bible was given to the church to bring about moral formation in the church. And very broadly speaking, one can say that they're reading the Bible well to the extent that they read it in such a way that brings about that moral formation, thereby increasing the love of God and neighbor. And if they read the Bible in such a way that it doesn't increase moral formation or bring about the love of God and neighbor, then that's a good evidence that they're reading the Bible poorly. So that would be my very quick response to you. And there's true that Christians have often read the Bible poorly in such a way that it decreased the love of God or of neighbor. And I would certainly want to critique those readings.
Well, thank you for that, Tree. Mace, yeah, I think it was Tree. Okay, Mace, welcome, buddy. What's your question?
So
we have no new callers joining the queue, by the way. Next person who tries to join, I'm smacking you down to the hell that is the listeners. All right, go ahead, Mace.
Firstly, I'd just like to say, don't listen to Scott. The guy's full of crap, and he often parks in disabled spaces, even though he's not disabled. Now, for my question. If you could go back in time to when the Christianity was first created, and you could meet with the original creator, be that man or God, what suggestions for improvements would you give them?
So I wouldn't give God suggestions for improvement because, I believe God is omniscient, and I believe God knew what God was doing. I do recognize that often things look in such a way that the natural response is to think, well, I would have done things differently. But just to frame the relationship epistemologically between God and the creature or the human being like myself, it's kind of like comparing a master and an apprentice, where, let's say, the master has studied for 70 years and is the world's master on whatever the skill is, and the apprentice comes on the first day, and the master gives the apprentice certain directions as to what they should do. The apprentice would be foolhardy to question the wisdom of the master, who's been doing this for 70 years, when the apprentice has such limited knowledge about this field. And I think we can think analogically that that's something like the relationship of the limited finite knower like myself relative to God. So do I think, well, Jesus shouldn't have incarnated, he shouldn't have died, that I would have done things differently? I think it would be foolhardy to speculate in that way, given my limited knowledge.
Yeah, this is when I talk to my very explicitly religious friends with moral conundrums that I hear, this is what they always say. It's like, dude, you're so limited. You can't do that questioning. You're in no position. Yeah, definitely interesting way of thinking about it. Scott snuck in again. Scott, you have to be very quick.
Yeah, so, sorry. I want to say thank you, Randall. I apologize. I didn't mean to come off so hot. Your response was amazing. That was great. I do have one question though. Do you think you could be wrong?
Of course. So I'm what we call an epistemic fallibilist. I have some background in epistemology. I did it in my doctoral work. So I recognize we can be wrong about all sorts of things. We can be wrong about our moral intuitions, our logical intuitions, our memory, our testimony. So when we trust what other people tell us, down the line, we can be wrong about all sorts of things. Hey, we could be brains in vats for all we know. This could be a very vivid dream. I'll just give you an example. I like this example for dreams. And a couple of years ago, I had this, I thought it was a dream, because I was looking at my motorbike, but it had a different paint job on the gas tank. And I'm like, this is a dream. But then I said, but I could be awake. So what I'm going to do is pay very close attention to my surroundings to see whether it's a dream or whether I'm awake. And so I listened carefully, and I could hear music playing in the background. And I looked very carefully at the tank, and it had a sort of weightiness to it that often you don't get in dreams, where they're kind of like very much moving very fast and things change quickly. No, everything was very stable here. So I concluded, okay, actually I am awake. And then I woke up. And I was like, oh, dang, man, I got that one wrong. Well, if I can get that wrong, certainly I can get all sorts of things wrong. So it's okay to have epistemic humility. I mean, Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, right now we see darkly as through a glass. Anyway, beyond that, I appreciate your. I wasn't offended by your first comments. I can certainly handle it, but I appreciated that you spoke plaintively to me. But I also appreciate your follow up. So thank you very much.
I have a follow up question. Do you think you could be wrong about the idea that loving one's neighbor is important? Is that within your epistemic humility? That falls within? Yeah. Okay. Just
look. I mean. That. I think, but what we do is when you're reflecting on what you could be wrong on, what you have to when you come up to like there's evidence that seems to conflict with what you think is wrong, what you have to do is you have to ask yourself, which of those two things do I ultimately think I know with greater strength? So, for example, let's say I believe it is wrong to harm people, and then I come around to my friend's house and I find him in the backyard, and he has a person tied up, and he's inflicting torture on them. And he says, come on, you got to trust me. Let's do this. In that moment, I have to say, am I going to trust him that my moral intuitions are wrong, that it's wrong to torture people? Or am I going to think, in fact, this guy that I thought was a really good person is crazy or a psychopath or somehow had a mental breakdown, and I'm not going to participate, and I'm going to try to stop him? And that's the kind of question that we have to ask ourselves whenever we have an apparent contradiction, right? A tension. And in cases like that, I'm going to go with my moral intuitions, which I think are among the deepest, most stable things that I know.
Right. And I think this is where this type of epistemic humility that you prescribe is different from a lot of atheistic ones, because from the atheists that I talk to, they seem much more willing to throw off their moral intuitions and trust the physical, as opposed to the other way around. So I noticed that those were not the same for you, and I enjoy that difference. I tend to agree with it. All right, last caller, Aaron. All right, all up to you, man. What you got for us? How you doing?
So, I unfortunately was not able to listen to about 99% of this call, but I saw what your book was about, and I have to ask this question. Now, I'm assuming that when you say without formal belief, you're speaking of without following every tenet of the Bible to the letter, including all of the commandments, not just the one.
You're cutting out a little bit there, Aaron. He's cutting out for you too, right?
Yeah. But I can. So Aaron, I'll just say that. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So I'm assuming that when you say without formal belief, you're talking about without following every tenet of the Bible to the letter. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So the thing is.
Okay. So
just give me a second here. Yeah. So what I had summarized earlier was that we love God and neighbor. That Jesus summarized that that's the teaching of the law that we have to follow. Guys, I gotta go in about 1 minute. Unfortunately, I just realized I got another meeting I got to get to.
Well,
sorry,
no
but
worries
yeah.
at all.
So what is most important in terms of the law is the love of God and neighbor, and that's what Jesus says, right? That he says there are these 600 plus other laws in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, but if you really want to be sure that you've got the law correct, then love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That summarizes the essence of the law.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rauser. Appreciate having you on. Thank you for your flexibility. Have a good one.
You bet. Okay, guys, take care. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Very interesting. Yeah, no, it was really enjoyable. I like talking to him. I would have loved to have picked his brain on more like contemporary political issues, although I suppose he would have answered them like very much the same way. I think if I asked him about abortion, he'd say Christians can be for and against reasonably. Yes, I do have to go in the next like 10 minutes here, but I figured we could do like a quick convo. If any, oh my God, there's 3 more callers. I have to go in like 10 minutes. So I will without mercy end this show. But yeah, he does seem to be left wing. Although I don't think that's a fair comparison. I think he's just I think the way that his theology works is that he finds himself typically at odds with people who are on the right. I don't think it's because he's like left wing. I think it's just because, right wing evangelicals are just the people who he contradicts the most often. And so you get that sense. But yes, things like, I think if you asked him about things like abortion, things like immigration, I think he basically said you can be Christian and you can be on both sides of this. About transing of the kids, actually, I don't know where he'd be on that. Stuff like that. I think he could say that you can be attempting to be Christian on both sides of those things. Which I guess is technically true. But still feels kind of weird. All right, yeah, Aaron, if you wanted to finish up what your question was, we can talk about it.
Well, my question would be, if you can be a Christian without being formal about it, then you could technically be any religion without being formal about it. And so, how would you be able to distinguish? That's what I don't get.
Right. Well, Randall would say that it depends on what you mean by be Christian. Like, it's just that idea. I asked him this exact question. So if you want to listen to the show after we put it up, I did ask him like literally this question. And I think the answer is basically it's about intent. If you want to be a part of the Christian community and you're attempting these steps, then you are on the outer periphery of Christianity. But if you're doing the exact same thing with your intent towards another religion, then maybe you'd be taking the first steps towards that. Although in his mind, as if you're practicing Christian doctrine, then fundamentally Aslan, the lion, aka Christ, will be accepting you no matter what. He did get into believing in the resurrection. Yeah, I mean, there's very long apologetic books about that are interesting. But I think that's what he'd say. I think he'd give you an unsatisfying but probably very honest and interesting answer. Seemed to be the idea. All right, Brett, what's up, man?
Hey, man, I know you got to go, so I'll try to make this quick.
Yeah.
So do you see at least I saw it from the things he was talking about. Do you see his point on how the demand of religious association separates people into groups and then they don't act morally towards one another? Because that's a point, and maybe I hope that's not just me projecting, but that's a point I've tried to make on this show before, that the fundamental ethic is treating your neighbor as yourself. And correct. It doesn't matter what background your neighbor is. And that's why I asked him about the thing of like, why do you think we do such a bad job at it? But do you see where he's coming from there?
No, I think he's right. I mean, okay. I think that's one of the fundamental religious assumptions is that man is fallen and sinful and we do stupid shit like divide ourselves, but we should all love each other. Now, I think the real question is what that love looks like, because I think that's probably a good explanation of all of politics, actually, is trying to determine what loving thy neighbor actually looks like, because I'm more of a kind of stern, tough love. type of guy, I suppose, make you strong enough to deal with the world. And then, people on the left might see love entirely differently and do their loving in ways that I find perverse and harmful. So I think that we all agree on that. I think it's just what that love looks like is kind of the fundamental political question.
Yeah.
But no, I 100% agree with you, Benson, that we shouldn't divide ourselves. No matter what divisions we have, and no matter how important those divisions are, fundamentally, we're all still made in the image of God, literally or metaphorically, and we should all do our best to look out for each other to the extent that that's possible.
Yeah, I really, I think Jesus would, feed the poor and not spend $14 million on Super Bowl commercials.
Yeah, well, again, I think this is also a real debate is like, well, when we're talking about Christianity, like, does this generalize? So Christ said that, like, obviously, if you're following the teachings of Christ, you should be generous and you should give to charity. Does that extend to saying the government should tax people very heavily and give their money to charity? Does that transfer? Because that's the argument for, like, Christ being a socialist. I mean, I don't know if I really buy that, but it's kind of the argument, right? Is how much does it generalize? But I agree. I mean, I think if everybody in the nation lived by Christian principles, we would be putting our money towards very different things. All right, Benson's going to stop. Yeah, Benson and I could talk forever, so thanks. Appreciate that. We have like 5 minutes left before I am like assassinated through this window or something dramatic. Tree, what's up, buddy? Or actually, Vlad. Sorry, Vlad. He's been waiting.
So
what's up, Vlad?
like one of my bigger issues, I guess, is this idea of like what makes you a Christian.
He's an author.
Specifically,
I only learned about him a few months ago.
If you're an atheist, right? If you don't believe in God, right?
So
what about Christianity is unique to Christianity,
find us on,
right? Other than the name of God and the stories about God's actions and the history of the Israelites, right? So if you're just trying to be a Christian on its own, like, is there something that like would distinguish you morality-wise from a Buddhist?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's cool too. Yeah, nice to talk to you, Vlad. Yeah, I think it's cool too. Although, like, maybe this is like internal bigotry or something. Although I kind of doubt it. Is that it's very difficult for me to see a church that's like adorned in like LGBTQ flags and it's like abortion is great, etc., and to think of that as Christian. It's very difficult, and I would have loved to pose that thought experiment to him. And again, you could argue that they're trying to love their neighbor, right? They're trying to love their neighbor, and the more orthodox as opposed to progressive churches just disagree on the proper way to love your neighbor. But this is why I have this question: but isn't the proper way to love your neighbor also in the Bible? Isn't like there's like some rules and moralist tales that tell you how to love your neighbor as you would love yourself. Stuff like that. Those are some questions. Maybe we'll have them back. We'll see. Tree.
So
what's going on, man?
So Buddhists don't try to escape suffering. They actually say life is suffering, and you actually try to not escape suffering in order to suffer less. But
well, from a Buddhist, so from an atheist perspective,
I guess if you're talking about the afterlife, then you could sort of say the same thing about
first
heaven
into
and
Buddhism.
And that kind of
from Rauser's
idea.
perspective,
I don't one of the
think so.
Buddhism I've
But
listened to,
it's just the entrance, and as you get deeper into it, differences
not
start
that.
to
But
emerge,
like
and those differences
going
are
back to the original topic
but
or the
I
main
think
topic,
the idea that lots of religions
I think
are
like a
drawing
really
on the
critical
same
part here
fundamental
will be
wellspring,
authority, right, as well,
is
because like there's different
I think it's
interpretations of
something.
the
I mean,
Bible,
Rauser was
right,
talking
and there's
about
a lot
it
of
on the,
ideas ideas that don't come from the Bible directly.
Again, it was some point in the show he was talking about this, but I think the answer is basically to your question, like no. The only thing differentiating an atheist first getting into Christianity as opposed to getting in other religions, because they're similar on the most basic level, would be intent. And then as you get into it,
if you're trying to adopt, like, where's the actual, like, true morality of Christianity, it's actually really difficult to discover, and it's no more apparent than when you look at, like, evangelicals voting for Donald Trump, in America. But if you look at other Christian religions, other parts of Christianity, especially in South America, you have liberation theology that actually be way more Marxist and
but I think the answer to your question is no.
Socialist worldview. So, like, there's no actual particular authority unless you're sort of just going, well, what is the religion I was brought up in, or something like that, Because
no. Wait, hold on. I might be understanding Eastern. Let me speak more precisely to see if I'm actually misunderstanding Buddhism. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. They say that you want to get rid of attachments because attachments are the root of suffering, and so, right, by transitive principle, is that not the escaping of suffering? Is nirvana not the escape from suffering? Is trying to avoid attachments not trying to avoid suffering? I'm doing it. Yeah, well, this is right. This is actually the problem that Catholics and Orthodox don't like Protestants for. The idea of Scripture alone doesn't work because of that interpretive flexibility. So you would argue that the tradition of the Church Fathers and Catholicism and Orthodoxy would be the solve to that. But again, not all Christians agree. So that would be the answer to, that would be my very humble answer as not being a theologian. That would be my answer for that. Yes, 11 minutes since my 10-minute warning. It is over. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was very fun. I didn't know how this was going to go between myself and Randall, but I think it went really well. Join our Discord. We have conversations like this each and every day on a whole variety of subjects in voice and text chat. So please join us. It's where I got my start. It's a good spot. Thank you all for being here. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.